I've always believed ghost stories were just old legends, until I found myself standing in places where history refuses to rest. The UK is filled with grand castles, quiet villages, and forgotten ruins, but hidden in their silence are stories that still send chills down people's spines. These aren't just tales from books, they are screams still echoing in empty halls, shadows caught in the corner of your eye, and voices that seem too real to ignore. Tonight, I'll take you inside 5 of the most terrifying ghost stories in the UK, stories that continue to haunt people even today. If you enjoy exploring the darker side of history with me, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next chilling story. 1. The Screaming Ghost of Borley Rectory, Essex. I still remember the night I visited Borley Rectory in Essex, a place often called the most haunted house in England. Even though the original house was destroyed in a fire decades ago, the ground where it once stood still carries an atmosphere that makes your skin crawl. Locals told me stories of a screaming nun, and I thought it was just another legend, until I found myself standing there, listening to the silence of the countryside. It was late evening when I arrived. The sky had turned dark, and a cold wind seemed to whisper through the trees. The land was empty, but the air felt strangely heavy, almost as if the walls of the rectory were still standing around me. I walked slowly, every step echoing on the gravel, when suddenly I felt it, the sensation of being watched. I stopped, my heart pounding harder than before. There was no one around, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were fixed on me. The story goes that a young nun once tried to escape the rectory with her secret lover, only to be caught and punished. She was said to have been buried alive within the grounds, and her spirit never left. As I stood there, remembering this tale, I heard something faint, a low cry carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the sound grew louder, turning into a desperate scream that echoed through the night. It was so sharp, so full of pain, that my chest tightened. I could feel goosebumps rising all over my arms. I wanted to run, but my legs felt frozen. The scream seemed to come from the ruins ahead, where the rectory once stood. My eyes searched the darkness, and for a brief moment, I saw a figure, a pale shadow shaped like a woman, dressed in what looked like a nun's habit. She was standing still, but her face was hidden in the shadows. Just as quickly as I saw her, she vanished into the night, leaving nothing but silence behind. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what happened. The villagers had warned me that the nun still roams the grounds, mourning her fate and terrifying anyone who dares to come close. That night, I finally believed them. What I heard and saw was no trick of the imagination. It was real as the chill that still lingers in my bones when I think of Borley Rectory. To this day, whenever someone asks me if ghosts are real, I don't tell them stories from books or television. I tell them about that night in Essex, when I stood face to face with the screaming ghost of Borley Rectory. 2. The Hooded Monk of Chillingham Castle, Northumberland. The first time I walked into Chillingham Castle, I could feel the weight of its history pressing down on me. The thick stone walls, the narrow corridors, and the dim candlelight in the great hall gave the place an eerie stillness. I had heard stories of a hooded monk who was seen wandering the castle, but I didn't come here expecting to meet him. I only wanted to see the infamous torture chambers and learn about its dark past. Still, somewhere deep inside, I carried a nervous excitement. That night, after the guided tour, a few of us stayed behind for what they called a ghost vigil. The castle felt completely different once the doors were closed and the tourists gone. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of old wood. I remember sitting in one of the smaller rooms near the chapel. The air there was colder than the rest of the castle, and the candles flickered as if someone was moving nearby, though none of us did. At first, I brushed it off as just drafts moving through the cracks in the stone. But then something strange happened. From the corner of the room, I felt a shift, as though a shadow had stepped into the light. I turned my head and froze. There, just a few feet away, stood a figure in a long, dark hooded robe. His face was hidden, and his posture was completely still, almost unnaturally so. My chest tightened, and every hair on my body stood on end. No one else in the room seemed to react, so for a moment I wondered if I was imagining it. But then the figure slowly turned, almost gliding rather than walking, and moved toward the doorway. I felt my throat dry up as if I wanted to call out but couldn't. The air smelled faintly of old incense, like the inside of a church, and it followed him as he drifted away. The strangest part was that there was no sound, no footsteps on the cold stone floor, no rustle of fabric, nothing. He simply passed through and vanished into the corridor beyond. My heart pounded so loud I thought everyone around me could hear it. One of the others must have noticed my pale face because they asked if I was all right. I didn't even know how to answer. Later, when I told the guide what I had seen, he simply nodded and said, "That would be our monk. He's been here longer than any of us." His calmness unsettled me even more. It wasn't just a legend to them, it was a reality they had accepted. Even now, I can still picture that hooded figure in the half-light of the chapel. It felt like he wasn't just a ghost but a memory of the castle itself, forever trapped in those walls. And I know this, if you ever spend a night at Chillingham, you may leave with more than just stories. You might carry the monk's shadow with you too. 3. The Red Lady of Hampton Court Palace, London. I had always been fascinated by the stories of Hampton Court Palace, but nothing could prepare me for the feeling of actually walking through its corridors at night. The palace is magnificent during the day, bright courtyards, echoing halls, and portraits of kings and queens on every wall. But when the last tourists leave and the lights grow dim, the atmosphere changes completely. It feels like the shadows themselves begin to whisper. That evening, I joined a small group for a night tour. We were led down the long gallery, where the story of Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of King Henry VIII, is still told with a shiver. She was accused of betrayal and dragged away screaming, begging for her life. The guards took her through the corridor to the tower, where she met her fate. They say her desperate cries never left the palace, and some even claim to see her ghost, known as the Red Lady, rushing down that same hallway. When I first stepped into the gallery, I felt an immediate chill. The air was heavy, pressing against my chest, and my footsteps echoed louder than they should have. I tried to stay close to the group, but something pulled my eyes toward the far end of the hallway. That's when I noticed her. At first, it looked like a faint blur. Almost like smoke gathering into the shape of a woman. Slowly, the outline became clearer. She was wearing what looked like a gown, pale and faded red, the kind you'd expect from a Tudor portrait. Her head was lowered, her hair falling across her face, and then suddenly she threw her hands up as though she was crying out. The sound that followed made my blood run cold. It wasn't just a sound, it was a scream, high and broken, filled with a kind of despair I had never heard before. My knees felt weak, but I couldn't move. I watched as she ran toward the center of the gallery, her figure flickering like a candle flame. Just as she reached the spot where the guards had once dragged her centuries ago, she disappeared, gone as if she had never been there at all. The silence that followed was deafening, and I realized my hands were shaking. The guide saw my face and whispered, "You've seen her, haven't you?" I could only nod. The others looked puzzled, but I knew what I had witnessed. It wasn't a trick of the light, and it wasn't imagination. It felt raw, real, and terrifying, like Catherine herself had returned to relive her final moments. To this day, whenever I think of Hampton Court Palace, I don't picture the grand halls or the gardens. I remember that scream echoing down the gallery, and the pale figure in red who will never find peace. For the ghostly villagers of Pluckley, Kent, England's most haunted village. When people told me Pluckley was the most haunted village in England, I thought it was just a tourist attraction, something exaggerated for visitors. But the moment I stepped into that quiet little place, I realized there was something different in the air. The village looked normal in daylight, small cottages, narrow lanes, and a peaceful countryside charm. Yet as the sun set, the streets seemed to hold their breath, and I could feel the weight of untold stories pressing against me. I decided to walk through the village alone, just to see if the tales were true. The first place I stopped was the old churchyard. The silence there was so deep that I could hear my own heartbeat. I stood by the gravestones when suddenly, a faint cry echoed in the air. It was soft at first, like someone sobbing far away. I froze, listening harder. The sound grew clearer, a man's voice, filled with sorrow. My throat tightened, and I felt the urge to call out, but I didn't dare. Leaving the churchyard, I followed the road toward a small wooded area where locals had warned me about a screaming man seen by many. As I reached the trees, the air grew icy cold. Then it happened, an ear-piercing scream tore through the silence. It was so sharp and sudden that I staggered back. My chest felt heavy, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The scream echoed around me, and though I spun in every direction, I saw no one. Shaken, I continued down the lane toward the spot where the highwayman was said to appear. The night was darker now, and only the moonlight guided my steps. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a shadow dart between the hedges. It wasn't a normal shadow, it moved too quickly, too deliberately. I stopped, and there he was, a tall figure, his outline clear against the pale light. Before I could even process what I was seeing, he lifted his arm as if holding a sword, then vanished into thin air. By the time I reached the small bridge at the edge of the village, I was trembling. There, locals claimed to see ghostly horses. I thought it was just another tale, until I heard it. The sound of hooves, pounding hard against the ground. I looked into the mist and saw nothing, yet the sound grew louder, racing past me as if invisible riders were charging into the night. The wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it a strange, bitter smell, like burnt wood. I stood on that bridge for several minutes, unable to move, my heart racing faster than ever. I had gone to Pluckley thinking I'd hear a few spooky legends. Instead, I left knowing that some legends don't die. They walk those lanes, cry in the graveyard, and scream in the woods, still haunting the living. That night, I didn't just visit a village. I felt like I walked into a place where the dead still refused to rest. 5. The Headless Horseman of Blickling Hall, Norfolk. I arrived at Blickling Hall just before sunset, when the last orange light of the day painted the grand estate in shadows. From the outside, the mansion looked breathtaking, its red brick walls and wide garden stretched as far as the eye could see. But the locals had warned me, once darkness falls, Blickling is not just a beautiful place, it becomes a stage for one of the most terrifying ghosts in England. The story I had always heard was of Anne Boleyn, the ill-fated wife of King Henry VIII. On certain nights, she is said to return to Blickling Hall in a ghostly carriage, driven by a headless coachman, with her own head resting in her lap. I never believed such tales could feel real, until the night I stood outside the hall waiting for silence to take over. The gardens grew still. Even the birds stopped singing. A thin mist began to rise from the ground, curling around my feet. I remember gripping the cold iron railing, telling myself it was just a legend. Then, from far down the path, I heard it, the distant sound of horses' hooves pounding against the earth. Slow at first, but growing louder with every second. My heart raced. There were no horses here, no riders, no reason for such a sound, yet it was real, echoing in the night air. And then I saw it. Out of the mist emerged a black carriage, pulled by 4 massive horses with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. The carriage rolled forward without a sound from its wheels, as if gliding just above the ground. My breath caught in my throat when I saw the figure inside. A woman dressed in a faded Tudor gown sat upright, her pale face lit by an otherworldly glow. In her lap, she held something I will never forget, her severed head, resting against her arms, the eyes empty but fixed forward. I couldn't move. My legs felt heavy as stone. The carriage passed just a few feet away, and the air turned icy cold. The horse's breath steamed like smoke, and the coachman, headless, cloaked in shadows, snapped his reins though there was no sound of a whip. I swear, for a second, Anne Boleyn's lifeless eyes met mine, and I felt a wave of sorrow so deep it nearly broke me. The carriage rolled past me and disappeared into the mist as suddenly as it had appeared. The sound of the hooves faded into silence, and the night returned to stillness. But I stood there shaking, unable to believe what I had just witnessed. People say ghosts are just stories, but what I saw at Blickling Hall was no story. It was a memory come alive, a haunting that refuses to fade with time. And I know, deep down, if you ever stand there in the dark, you might hear those hooves too. Bringing back the headless horseman and his tragic queen.